One.
It's great to be here.
Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into Oscar Wilde's only novel,
Okay.
The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Yeah.
And if you want to follow along, there's a link down in the description where you can buy the book.
Awesome.
And this book caused quite a stir when it first came out, but over time it's become like this celebrated classic.
Yeah.
And I think as we dig in, we'll kind of discover why. The premise is so fascinating.
Right.
Like a man, he trades his soul for eternal youth and beauty, but his portrait, well, let's just say it ages a little bit differently.
It doesn't age so gracefully. It's almost like Wilde is saying you can't escape the consequences of your actions.
Oh, interesting.
That the portrait becomes this visual representation of Dorian's internal corruption, all the sins he's trying to hide from the world.
Right. And that blog post that we read, it compared Dorian's deal to people using Botox in surgery today.
Right.
And it really made me think, are we still making similar bargains, just, in different forms?
Yeah.
It feels very timeless, this whole struggle of wanting to project a certain image, but then also grappling with the reality of aging.
It's definitely something to ponder. And it's not just about vanity either, right?
Sure.
The novel seems to suggest that Dorian's desire for eternal youth is also tied to this deeper fear of losing power and opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of power, the characters in this book they're so captivating.
Right.
Dorian himself, obviously he's so fascinating. This handsome young man, he kind of just dives headfirst into a life of pleasure. So what did you think of his journey into hedonism? Was it as glamorous as it sounds?
Not really, and I think that's what makes it so interesting.
Okay.
One of the YouTubers that I was watching actually pointed out that Dorian's pursuit of pleasure seemed kind of empty, almost joyless. He had all of these experiences, but they didn't seem to bring him any real fulfillment.
Wow.
And it makes you question whether a life solely focused on pleasure can ever truly satisfy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then there's Lord Henry. He's this charming but cynical aristocrat who basically plants the seeds for Dorian's downfall.
Right.
And I couldn't help but notice that even the YouTubers, the ones who found his philosophy kind of questionable,
Yeah.
they still called him charming.
Yeah, he is.
Which kind of reminded me of how another reviewer described Oscar Wilde himself
Okay.
as someone who was probably fun to hang out with,
Yeah.
despite his controversial views,
I can see the connection there. I mean, Lord Henry is witty, provocative. He's always ready with some clever quip,
Yes.
even if he's making fun of America.
Oh, yeah.
Which, by the way, is pure Wilde.
Right.
You can almost hear Wilde's own voice, shining through in those lines.
Yes, totally.
It makes you wonder how much of Lord Henry is actually Wilde himself, just kind of hiding in plain sight.
It's he's playing with these different facets of his own personality through the characters. And then there's Basil,
Right.
the artist who is utterly smitten with Dorian.
Yes.
He kind of represents a much more moral, almost innocent perspective, right?
Absolutely. Basil is drawn to Dorian's beauty, but he's also drawn to a certain purity he sees in him.
Interesting.
And their relationship with those homoerotic undertones that later editions try to erase
Oh, wow.
adds another layer of complexity to the story, I think.
Yeah, totally.
It speaks to those societal pressures and anxieties surrounding sexuality at the time.
It makes you realize how much context matters when you're interpreting literature. Right?
Yeah.
You can't separate the work from the time period in which it was written.
Totally.
But what really struck me was a blog post I was reading, and it mentioned that Wilde saw himself reflected in all three of the main characters.
Oh, interesting.
And I thought that was so fascinating.
It is a fascinating insight into Wilde's mind. He said that Basil represented who he believed he was.
Okay.
Lord Henry represented how the world perceived him.
Wow.
And Dorian represented who he wished he could be in other eras.
That's a lot to unpack.
It is.
And it makes you think about the masks that we all wear.
Right.
The different versions of ourselves that we present to the world.
Yeah.
Speaking of influences, one of the YouTube videos that I watched mentioned this, poisonous book.
Right.
That deeply impacts Dorian. Do we actually know what book that was?
It's widely believed to be J.K. Heisman's Against Nature.
Okay.
Which is a novel that celebrates decadence and aesthetic experience above all else.
Interesting.
So you can see how that philosophy would appeal to someone like Dorian.
Yes.
Who's increasingly obsessed with beauty and And sensory indulgence.
It's like the book kind of gives him permission
Yeah.
to fully embrace this hedonistic lifestyle.
Yeah, right.
Without, like, any regard for the consequences.
Right, exactly.
So if you're enjoying this deep dive so far,
Yes.
make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a review.
Yeah.
It really helps other bookworms discover the podcast.
Absolutely.
Now back to the Picture of Dorian Gray. What I find so compelling is like how Wilde tackles these like huge themes head on.
Right.
Like aestheticism, duplicity, hedonism.
He doesn't shy away from exploring, the dark side of human nature.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Take aestheticism, for example. The novel seems to question whether the pursuit of beauty, in and of itself, can ever be truly moral. Especially when it's, like, divorced from any sense of empathy or responsibility.
Right, and that duplicity, the contrast between, like, Dorian's public image and his, like, hidden life of sin.
Yeah, it's like Wilde is holding up a mirror to Victorian society and exposing, like, the hypocrisy lurking beneath the surface.
Totally.
Absolutely. It's a commentary on, this obsession with appearances, the pressure to conform to societal expectations, even if it means, like, sacrificing your true self.
Right, and then hedonism, this whole idea of just, like, seeking pleasure above all else.
Right.
It's so fascinating how Wilde shows both the allure and the emptiness of that lifestyle through Dorian.
Well, he's surrounded by luxury and beauty, indulging in every desire.
Yeah.
And yet he's utterly alone, incapable of forming genuine connections.
Right.
So it raises the question, can a life dedicated solely to pleasure ever be truly fulfilling?
Yeah, that's such a good question.
It is. Yeah, it really makes you think, like, what did Dorian really gain from this whole bargain?
Right.
I mean, sure, he got his youth, he got his beauty, but at what cost?
Exactly. And the way that Wilde describes, like, his gradual descent into darkness,
Yeah.
the way the portrait, like, reflects that inner corruption, it's
chilling.
Yeah, one reviewer even said it was one of the most horrific things they'd ever read.
I can see that. It's definitely chilling. And it's not even just the physical acts of violence, right? It's the emotional cruelty that he inflicts on other people.
Yeah.
The way that he manipulates and just destroys the people around him.
It's like his pursuit of pleasure has just, like, completely warped his sense of empathy.
Yeah.
He's so consumed by his own, like, desires that he becomes almost blind to the suffering that he's causing.
Right. And that portrait, it's almost like this constant reminder, right, of his actions,
Right.
like this growing burden that he can't escape.
Yeah, exactly. Like a symbol of the weight of his guilt, the inescapable truth of who he has become.
Right. And it further isolates him.
Yeah.
Because he can't share his secret. He can't really connect with anybody for
Yeah.
fear of being exposed.
It's so, like, tragic, that isolation.
Yeah.
He's surrounded by all these people, all these admirers, but he's totally alone. Which, speaking of, makes me think about the writing itself.
Okay.
You know, one reviewer mentioned that they felt like they were constantly aware of Oscar Wilde's presence,
Yeah.
like in the prose,
Okay.
especially in the dialogue.
Yeah, Wilde's voice it's unmistakable.
Yeah.
He was a master of wit, he loved wordplay, and the dialogue often feels like you're watching a verbal sparring match, you know?
Yes.
Full of these, like, clever observations and pointed barbs.
But it's so quick.
Yeah, one reviewer said that it forces you to read quickly, just to keep up
Yes,
with
absolutely.
the pace of the conversation.
It's exhilarating, but I also feel like it serves a deeper purpose.
Right.
Like he uses those witty exchanges to, like, explore some pretty serious topics,
Yeah.
to, like, challenge those societal norms and expose the hypocrisy
Right.
that's kind of lurking beneath the surface of these polite conversations.
It's like he's inviting us to think critically about everything, to question, everything we think we know about beauty, about morality, about the pursuit of pleasure.
And I think that's what makes this book so timeless, is that challenge, right?
Right, because it speaks to something so fundamental about the human condition, about our desires, our fears, our capacity for good and for evil.
So as we kind of move into this final part of our discussion, I'd love to hear from you, our listeners.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the Picture of Dorian Gray so far? What parts of the story have, like, resonated with you the most?
Yeah, what are your favorite parts?
Share your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're at it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave us a review.
Yeah, please do.
It really does help us reach more bookworms.
Like it does.
All right, so let's
jump back in.
let's get back to the Picture of Dorian Gray. Yeah, it's amazing how a book that was written over a century ago can still spark, like, such lively discussions today. It really speaks to Wilde's ability to kind of tap into these, like, universal truths about human nature.
Absolutely. And, going back to what we were talking about earlier,
Right.
it feels like such a personal novel. Like, Wilde is really grappling with his own identity and his own desires.
Yeah.
Like, through these characters like Basil, with his artistic integrity, Lord Henry, and his, like, flamboyant wit.
Yeah.
And then Dorian and his relentless pursuit of pleasure. They all feel like different facets of Wilde himself.
It's almost like he's, like, having a conversation with himself,
Yeah, totally.
like exploring all of these, like, different impulses and their potential consequences.
Yeah, and inviting us to join that conversation, too.
Right.
I mean, Wilde, he really doesn't shy away from challenging those social norms, right?
No, he doesn't.
He wants us to question our own assumptions about beauty and morality and the meaning of life, really.
It really makes you think.
It does.
I think one of the most striking things about the book for me was the ending.
Okay.
Dorian's attempt to, like, destroy the portrait, the way that it ultimately leads to his own destruction.
Right.
Such a, like, powerful image.
Yeah, it's a very tragic end.
Yeah.
But it's also deeply symbolic, don't you think?
Totally.
It kind of suggests that you can't simply erase the past
Right.
or escape the consequences of your actions. Like, trying to destroy the evidence of his sins only ends up sealing Dorian's fate.
Yeah, it's like that saying, the only way to, like, get rid of temptation is to yield to it.
Right.
Dorian spent his whole life trying to, like, outrun his true self.
Yeah.
Like, the ugliness that he saw reflected in that portrait. But maybe, like, confronting those darker impulses,
Right.
acknowledging them,
Yeah.
that's the only way to really move forward.
That's a really powerful thought.
It is?
And it raises an important question for all of us. Like, can we ever truly escape the consequences of our choices? Or is it, in facing them head on, learning from our mistakes, that we find redemption?
It's definitely something to ponder as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion.
I'm left with this sense of awe at Wilde's, like, genius.
I agree.
He created a story that's both, like, beautiful and disturbing, witty and profound.
It's a novel that stays with you long after you've finished reading it.
Totally.
It makes you reconsider your own values, the choices that you make in your own life.
And I think that's, like, the mark of truly great literature, right?
Yes.
It's not just entertainment. It's like,
Yeah.
it's a mirror held up to our own souls, challenging us to, like, grow and evolve.
I love that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this journey through Oscar Wilde's masterpiece.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive, and if you did, make sure to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast and leave us a review.
Yeah, please do.
It really helps other book lovers find us. And be sure to check out the link in the description to get your own copy of The Picture of Dorian Gray.
It's worth it.
It's a classic for a reason.
Absolutely.
Until next time, happy reading.